Well, thank you. And to be honest, this is a bit of a difficult position because there's so little left to add to what both Alex and Stephen have said. But I thought I'd take advantage of the fact that I'm probably the only one on the panel who grew up in a non-Catholic upbringing. So the perspective of the sort of Anglo-Saxon world and the Anglican view of freedom and how it develops. And at the heart of this is a sort of... is that better? Yeah. At the heart of this is a critical question that I think we've avoided so far, which is, what do we define by freedom? And there are two answers to that. The first is to talk about positive freedom. That is to say that you have your freedom at the behest of a benign state that allows you to do things. That is to say that in your constitution or in your laws, it says that you are given the right to something, for example, given the right to free speech, or the right to own property, or the right to have your own beliefs. Now, that doesn't fit in with the worldview of my own upbringing, where we talk more about what we describe as negative liberty. That is to say that your liberty comes from yourself. That is to say that you, rather than having the freedom to express yourself, are free from the state telling you that you cannot express yourself. That is to say that your freedoms are your own based on natural law and natural rights. And these are ideas that are explored throughout the Enlightenment. And so you find authors such as Thomas Hobbes with his famous book Leviathan, where he talks about the individuality of freedom and of liberty. And this is what is eventually developed into the British and American system. You see during the period in the build-up to the American Revolutionary War, the publication of things like the Federalist Papers or Thomas Paine's Common Sense Manifesto, where he talks about inalienable rights. And it's why in the opening of the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they talk about the inalienable rights of individuals. And the reason that we can know this to be true, that your rights are your own, are from the fact that we have to look at the nature of the state that we claim gives somebody their rights. Well, as we understand it from John Locke and the principle of the social contract, the state only exists due to the consent of the governed. That is to say that we as individuals allow our governments to rule over us because we have given them that right, that they don't have the right to tell us what to do. It is that they serve at our pleasure. And this is true not just in democracies and republics, but also in many ways in a constitutional monarchy. For example, in my own country, the royal family exists because there is no objection to them. There's no movement inside the United Kingdom that says we want to remove the king or that we want to replace him with somebody else. They even though they are allegedly born with the right to rule, have their position because we allow it through our consent. The other thing to take from that is that as we volunteer our liberty, we also volunteer liberties not just to the consent to create government, but also for consent to protect our liberties. That we give up a small amount of our freedoms to the state in order to protect ourselves, to guarantee our security. And we can see this in all sorts of areas. Sort of, for example, I'm trying to think, for example, giving up certain land rights that can be used for the positioning of a military base in a certain territory that defends our borders or so on. And this all fits within something that Stephen talked about, which is ultimately the rule of law, which is such an important aspect of understanding liberty, because we cannot allow the state to take our rights without a guarantee that it will look after them in the correct manner. And this is where I'm going to give you a perhaps surprising fact, which is that in 1936, the Constitution of the USSR, the so-called Stalin Constitution, was the most liberal constitution in the world at the time. Article 124 guaranteed the freedom of religion. It said that anybody could be a member of whatever faith group they wanted to be and express their belief. Article 122 guaranteed the role of women in this society and allowed people, women equal rights and freedom. Article 125 guaranteed free speech, that you could say whatever you wanted, that you could gather in whatever crowd you wanted to and associate with the people you freely wanted to, except that we know that that wasn't the case. For anyone who understands the history of the USSR, we know that you couldn't do those things. That if you were a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, you would be deported to Siberia. That if you expressed views contrary to those of the communist elite, you would end up in a gulag. And that women didn't enjoy equal rights to men in many aspects of Soviet life. Why was that? Well, it was because they didn't have the rule of law. It was because the authorities that governed didn't govern with the consent of the people as much as they ruled over them and gave them the instructions that they wanted to. And this is, I think, at the fundamental core of all of what we need to learn and what we need to believe, is that it is the responsibility of the people to ensure the rule of law, to hold their governments to account, to protect their own freedom. And the other thing to take from this is that in that same constitution were guaranteed material rights. The Soviet constitution guaranteed the right, a right to food, a right to a home, a right to... These are fundamentally impossible to deliver. Something that we have to understand about rights and freedoms are that they are immaterial. You cannot express something and say that this is my piece of free speech. I'm holding up my freedom of speech right now. No, you can't do that. These are internalized views. You see this in George Orwell's 1984, where the main character, Winston Smith, is hiding a diary from the public, from the authorities. And I think in the opening chapters of the book, he writes, "I know that I'm not allowed to write this." But he's still able to. And this notion of material equality has in many ways come to usurp our own freedom. The left around the world hang over this notion of inequality as a means of stripping away the rights and liberties of ordinary people. Alex talked about property rights. That is the perfect example. When you see a government talking about redistributive policies to support tackle the issue of inequality, what that usually means is that it's going to be redistributive. That is to say that they will take property from one person to give it to another. Stephen talked about the value of hard work and how capital is only developed by people. Well, in effect, what they're doing is stealing that right to capital. The people who work hard are now having their hard-earned material given to somebody else who has not deserved it. And this plague of material equality has been entrenched in international law now. And this is because when the UN Charter was being drafted in the 1940s, there was a need for compromise in order to keep the countries of the Eastern Bloc happy within the United Nations. And it, of course, helped that the Roosevelt government of the time, or the Truman government of the time, appointed Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a proponent of the New Deal, to draft some of these rights. So suddenly we ended up with unattainable positions that contradict each other, entrenched into international law. And this fundamentally, I believe, became the embodiment of the entire struggle of the Cold War. In the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc, it was deemed acceptable to take the property of one other person and give it to another. It was deemed acceptable to take the freedom of speech from somebody in order to create cohesion and avoid distrust of the government and so on. Whereas in the West, for us, it was about guaranteeing those rights, about fighting for them. And I think this is my sort of final point, which is I'll take a quote from Ronald Reagan, where he says, "Freedom is never more than a generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in our blood. It must be fought for, protected, and handed to them to do the same." And in effect, what we need to understand is that in order to guarantee our own individual freedom and our sense of freedom, we must be prepared to preserve it and to hand it on. And this is something that was very much learnt in this country during the Homeland War and is currently being learnt by Ukrainians today who are fighting for their own freedom against the tyranny of the Russian Federation. So I'll leave with those positions.